They brought me here on my 14th birthday, and that should tell you everything about how the Imperium values human life. I wasn't sick. I wasn't injured. I'd simply reached the age where my hive block's tithe assessment determined I possessed sufficient manual dexterity and expendability to serve in the Medicae auxilium of Hive Tertius. My mother wept when the conscriptors came, but quietly, because loud grief suggested disloyalty to the Emperor's will. My father made the sign of the Aquila and told me I was blessed to serve. I believed him then. I don't know what I believe now. 37 years later, standing in the same corridors where I first learned that mercy and medicine are not synonyms, that healing and horror wear the same white robes, that in the Imperium's hospitals, the line between patient and raw material is measured in heartbeats and economic utility. My first assignment was Ward 17, sub-level Gamma, a long rectangular room with a vaulted ceiling that might have been beautiful once, before the paint flaked away to reveal corroded rockcrete beneath. 200 beds lined the walls in perfect rows, each separated by exactly 1 meter, close enough for efficiency, far enough that a spreading infection might take hours instead of minutes to jump from patient to patient. The smell struck me before anything else, a miasma so thick I could taste it, suppurating wounds and disinfectant that was mostly promethium byproduct, recycled air that carried the copper tang of blood and the sweet rot of gangrene, human waste from patients too weak to reach the communal latrines at the ward's far end. I vomited in the first 10 minutes. Sister Carmilla, the ward's senior Medicae, watched without expression until I finished, then handed me a rag to clean my mouth and told me that was the last time weakness would be tolerated. The patients were industrial casualties mostly, workers from the manufactory levels who'd been damaged by their machines and deemed salvageable enough to warrant treatment. The administratum calculated the cost of healing versus the cost of replacement conscripts, and those whose recovery expenses fell below the replacement threshold were sent to us. The others, those too expensive to repair, went to the rendering plants where their component materials could be reclaimed. I learned not to wonder what happened to the protein supplements we fed the patients, what meat composed the nutri-paste that sustained both staff and those we treated. In the Imperium, waste is heresy, and human bodies contain many useful elements when properly processed. My duties were simple: change bandages, administer medications, record vital signs, assist the Medicae with procedures, clean when patients died, prepare bodies for removal. Sister Carmilla explained the protocols in a voice as flat and institutional as the walls around us. Bandages were to be washed and reused until they disintegrated. New cloth was expensive, and the mechanicus counted every meter. Medications came from the central dispensary in measured doses, never a drop more than prescribed, and if a patient died before completing their treatment course, the remainder was recycled for others. Vital signs were recorded every 4 hours in the ward's master ledger, a massive book whose pages were yellow with age and whose entries stretched back 3 centuries in an unbroken record of suffering and survival rates. The procedures I assisted with taught me that the human body can endure modifications that would kill it if the modifications are performed skillfully enough and the patient's will to live is sufficiently irrelevant to the outcome. I watched Sister Carmilla amputate a man's arm with a surgical saw while he screamed himself unconscious. Anesthetics were reserved for essential personnel, and factory workers didn't qualify. I held retractors while she extracted shrapnel from a woman's abdomen, the patient biting on a leather strap while her eyes rolled back and her muscles seized. I counted sponges after a chest surgery where we'd opened a man's ribcage to repair a punctured lung, and when I came up 1 sponge short, Sister Carmilla explained that finding it would require another surgery the patient wouldn't survive, so we would note the discrepancy in his file and hope his immune system dealt with the foreign object before infection set in. The beds filled and emptied with mechanical regularity. Patients arrived, received treatment, and either recovered enough to return to their factory posts or deteriorated to the point where continued treatment exceeded their economic value. Those who recovered were discharged with their wounds barely healed, fresh scars pink against grey skin, given a blessed Aquila medal and sent back to the machines that had broken them. Those who deteriorated were taken during the night shift, removed on gurneys to destinations I wasn't told about and learned not to ask. The empty beds would be scrubbed, a process that involved a stiff brush and the same promethium disinfectant that burned my hands raw, and new patients would arrive before the mattresses dried, because the quotas always exceeded our capacity, and the waiting lists contained names of people who would die before their turn came. I learned the rhythms of suffering during those first months. Mornings brought the screaming as patients woke to discover their injuries anew, their nights forgetting dissolved into days' agony. Mid-shifts were quieter. A low susurrus of moaning and whimpered prayers, the sound of 200 people in pain trying not to draw attention to themselves because attention meant you weren't healing efficiently, and inefficiency invited review, and review meant potential reclassification as unsalvageable. Evening brought the worst cases, the new arrivals with their shock-bright eyes and their belief that medical treatment meant relief, that hospitals were places of healing rather than industrial triage centers where human damage was assessed and processed according to economic algorithms I would never see. Sister Carmilla taught me to calculate whether a patient warranted pain medication by observing their work value potential. A skilled machinist with repairable injuries received analgesics because their training represented significant Imperial investment. An unskilled loader with similar injuries received a leather strap to bite and a lecture about offering suffering to the Emperor. I learned to make these assessments quickly, to look at a patient and see not a suffering human but a resource whose continued function had to be weighed against treatment costs. This was efficiency. This was proper stewardship of the Imperium's resources. This was what the Emperor required of those entrusted with the Medicae. The touch of human skin became routine, intimate in its constant necessity, yet utterly devoid of tenderness. I touched wounds, pressed gauze against bleeding, felt the heat of infected flesh through my thin latex gloves. I touched the cool skin of the dying, monitoring their pulses as they weakened, counting the seconds between heartbeats until the intervals stretched too long and I had to record another death in the ward's ledger. I touched the bodies after death, closing eyes that no longer saw, straightening limbs that had contorted in final agonies, removing the small personal effects that patients were allowed: prayer beads, family photos printed on flimsy plastic, letters from loved ones, and placing them in labeled bags for return to next of kin, though I knew most would never be claimed, because tracking down families in a hive of 12 billion was administratively expensive. The first time I killed someone, I didn't realize I'd done it. Patient 779, a middle-aged man with a crushed pelvis from a cargo loader accident. Sister Carmilla had prescribed a specific medication, and I'd gone to the dispensary to collect it. The bottles looked identical, same size, same shape, same faded labels in Gothic script. I was still learning to read fluently. I selected what I thought was the correct medication, administered the prescribed dose, and returned to my other duties. Patient 779 died during the night, his heart simply stopping, and the morning review revealed my error. I'd given him a muscle relaxant instead of an antibiotic, a dose sufficient to suppress his respiratory drive until he suffocated quietly in the dark. Sister Carmilla's response was instructive. She documented the incident in meticulous detail, filled out the required forms, submitted them to the administratum office that tracked such statistical variances. Then she told me that errors happen, that the Emperor judges us by our intentions rather than our outcomes, that one death was insignificant in the vast calculus of the Imperium's functioning. Patient 779's bed was filled within the hour. His family would receive notification of his death from industrial injury complications. The universe continued, uncaring, and I learned that guilt was an inefficient emotion that served no useful purpose. But the touch remained. The sensation of his cooling skin when I discovered his body at morning rounds, the way his chest didn't rise, the absolute stillness that separates the living from the dead. My hands remembered it, and from that day forward, every time I touched a patient, I felt that same cool stillness waiting beneath the warmth, felt death as a texture, a quality of skin that presaged its transformation from living vessel to empty meat. The touch became my signature sense, my way of reading patients, and I learned to feel things in flesh that the Medicae with their instruments and training couldn't detect: the subtle temperature differentials that indicated internal bleeding, the texture changes that meant tissue was dying, the coolness that meant death was approaching regardless of what the vital signs reported. Years passed. marked not by calendars but by the accumulation of touches, of bodies handled, of wounds dressed and deaths recorded. I advanced from auxiliary to assistant Medicae, then to Medicae proper when Sister Carmilla died, a sudden cerebral hemorrhage that dropped her mid-stride, her body collapsing like a puppet with cut strings. I inherited her position, her duties, her ward, her knowledge base acquired through 40 years of service in Hive Tertius's medical system. I trained new auxiliaries, teaching them the protocols and calculations, watching them vomit on their first days and harden over subsequent months into efficient components of the Medicae machine. Ward 17 became my entire world. I slept in a small room off the main floor, 4 meters square, with a cot and a footlocker and a shrine to the Emperor where I performed perfunctory devotions. I ate in the staff canteen, the same nutri-paste as the patients, sitting with other Medicae who'd gone years without seeing sunlight or breathing unprocessed air. We discussed caseloads and supply shortages and the latest administratum directives reducing our already inadequate budgets. We didn't discuss the ethical dimensions of our work, because ethics was a luxury for people who had choices, and we had only duties. The Imperium's medical philosophy, I came to understand, wasn't about healing, but about maintenance. The goal wasn't to restore people to health, but to keep them functional enough to serve, to extract maximum labor from bodies before they failed completely. The ward treated symptoms that impaired work capacity, while ignoring suffering that didn't. A worker with a broken hand received immediate surgery because hands operated machinery. A worker with chronic pain received nothing because pain didn't prevent basic motor function. We were mechanics servicing biological machines, and our job was to keep the machines running, not to concern ourselves with the operator's comfort. I performed a procedure that exemplified this philosophy at least once a week. Labor restoration, surgery, where we took workers whose injuries had reduced their function below acceptable thresholds and modified them to restore utility. A woman whose legs had been crushed received augmetic replacements, not sophisticated prosthetics like the tech priests wore, but crude hydraulic systems that allowed her to stand at her factory station for 12-hour shifts. A man whose lungs had been scarred by chemical exposure received a rebreather implant that forced oxygenated air directly into his bloodstream, allowing him to continue working in the same toxic environment that had damaged him. A child, Emperor's mercy. So many children who'd lost both arms in a stamping press accident received simple mechanical clamps that could grip tools, transforming them from useless dependent into functional worker. The touch of augmetic flesh was different from organic flesh, cold and hard and utterly lifeless, but I performed the installations with the same efficiency I brought to all procedures. The surgeries were crude, painful, performed with minimal anesthetic and maximum speed. We cut away damaged tissue with vibrosaws, installed augmetic interfaces by drilling directly into bone, sealed incisions with industrial adhesive that left angry scars. The patients screamed. They always screamed, but they survived, most of them, and survival meant return to service, and service was the highest virtue the Imperium recognized. The screaming became part of the ward's ambient sound, a constant undertone beneath the hum of life support systems and the breathing of 200 patients. I learned to differentiate screams, the sharp cry of acute pain versus the longer wail of despair, the hoarse rasp of someone who'd been screaming so long their voice was failing, the sudden silence when pain exceeded the body's capacity to express it. I learned to work through the screaming, to maintain steady hands while installing augmetic interfaces in patients who were conscious and terrified, and begging for mercy I wasn't authorized to provide. The touch of their skin against my gloved hands became my anchor to something I couldn't name anymore, not humanity, because that concept had eroded too completely, but perhaps to the memory of humanity, to the knowledge that these writhing, screaming bodies contained consciousnesses like my own, capable of suffering in ways that mattered, even if the Imperium systems didn't acknowledge their mattering. I touched them gently when I could, this small gesture that changed nothing but allowed me to feel like I was doing something beyond mere mechanical processing. I closed wounds carefully, arranged bodies with dignity after death, spoke quietly to patients who were conscious even when protocol didn't require communication. These small rebellions were my secret resistance against the ward's dehumanizing efficiency, a resistance so minor it was pathetic, but felt necessary to maintain some core of self that hadn't been completely subsumed into the Medicae machine. I don't know if the patients noticed or appreciated the gentle touches, the quiet words. Most were too deep in pain or medication haze to register external stimuli beyond the immediate sources of their suffering. But I noticed. I felt the difference in my hands between touching a patient as an object to be processed and touching them as a person who was suffering. And this difference, however insignificant in practical terms, kept some part of me from becoming completely what the Imperium wanted me to be. This changed when they brought the soldier in. Not a guardsman, his uniform was wrong, black armor marked with symbols I didn't recognize, damage patterns suggesting combat against enemies I'd only heard whispered rumors about. He'd been found in the underhive, dying of wounds that looked like burns but weren't, skin blackened and cracking but cold to the touch, flesh underneath showing colors that living tissue shouldn't contain. The Arbites who delivered him wore protective gear and spoke through Vox grills, warning us about potential contamination, telling us he'd been exposed to proscribed weaponry during an engagement against forces they couldn't name because the names were classified at levels above our clearance. He was conscious when they brought him in, his eyes tracking movement with horrible clarity, his mouth working around words he couldn't vocalize because his throat had been damaged. I touched his skin during the initial examination and recoiled. It felt wrong, felt like touching something that was neither alive nor dead, but occupying some intermediate state, cold and warm simultaneously, textured like human flesh, but with an underlying slickness that made my skin crawl. Sister Yevena, who'd become the senior Medicae after Sister Carmilla's death, ordered a full quarantine protocol, but the damage was done. Whatever contamination the soldier carried had already spread through contact. The symptoms began within hours. First, the temperature our bodies couldn't regulate properly anymore, alternating between burning fever and hypothermic cold regardless of environmental conditions. Then the touch sensation, everything felt wrong, felt simultaneously too intense and completely numb, our proprioception failing so we didn't quite know where our limbs were in space. Then the visual distortions, shadows that moved independently of light sources, colors that didn't match reality, patients whose bodies seemed to flicker between different configurations faster than eyes could track. Sister Yevena tried to contain it, implementing isolation protocols that came too late. The contamination wasn't biological. Tests showed no bacterial or viral agents, but something else, something the medical texts didn't describe. It spread through touch, through proximity, through channels we couldn't identify or interrupt. Within 2 days, every staff member in Ward 17 was symptomatic. Within 4 days, the patients were showing signs. Within a week, the entire ward had become something other than a hospital, something that looked like a hospital superficially, but whose fundamental nature had shifted into territory I didn't have vocabulary to describe. The touch became unbearable. Every patient I examined felt wrong in different ways. Skin that rippled under my fingers like water, flesh that felt solid but my hands passed partially through, bodies whose internal anatomy had rearranged itself according to geometries that violated basic biological principles. A woman whose arm I was bandaging had a radius that intersected with her ulna in the middle of her forearm, both bones occupying the same space impossibly. A man whose chest I was examining had 3 hearts arranged in a triangular formation, all beating but out of sync with each other, creating rhythm that made my own heart stutter in sympathy. A child whose temperature I was taking had skin that changed texture under my fingers, cycling through rough and smooth and something that felt like nothing at all. I tried to document these findings, to record the changes in the ward's master ledger, but the words I wrote transformed as I watched. Gothic script, rearranging into languages I didn't know but could suddenly read, conveying information I didn't want to understand. The ledger's pages showed patient histories that hadn't happened yet, death records for people who were currently alive, treatment protocols for conditions that didn't exist in any medical taxonomy I'd been taught. I closed the book and didn't open it again, afraid of what accumulated knowledge it might contain. Sister Yevena called for help, using the ward's Vox system to contact the hospital's administration, requesting immediate evacuation and specialist intervention. The response came 12 hours later. Ward 17 was under quarantine. No one was to enter or leave. All personnel and patients were to remain confined until further notice. Food and supplies would be delivered via automated servitors to the ward's entrance. A tech priest would arrive to assess the situation. We were to continue providing medical treatment to the best of our abilities. The Emperor protects. The tech priest never came. Or perhaps he did and couldn't find us, because the ward was changing in ways that defied architectural consistency. Corridors that should have led to the exit looped back on themselves. Doors opened onto the same room seen from different angles. The ceiling height varied, sometimes a vaulted arch 10 meters above, sometimes pressing down close enough to touch. The 200 beds remained in their neat rows, but counting them produced different numbers, sometimes 190, sometimes 230, the discrepancy unexplainable because no beds had been added or removed. The patients were changing too, their bodies responding to the contamination in individual ways. Some were healing impossibly fast, wounds closing in hours, bones knitting overnight, conditions that should have required months of treatment resolving spontaneously. Others were deteriorating just as rapidly, flesh necrotizing despite all interventions, organs failing one by one in cascading system collapse. And some, perhaps the worst, were transforming, their bodies modifying in ways that surgery and augmentation couldn't explain, growing new structures, losing essential components, reconfiguring their basic architecture according to patterns I couldn't predict or prevent. I continued treating them because it was all I knew how to do. I touched their changing flesh with my increasingly strange hands. My own fingers had developed a sensation of multiplicity, as if each hand possessed more than 5 fingers, but occupying the same 5 physical spaces, and tried to provide what comfort I could. Bandages wrapped around limbs that phased in and out of material existence. Medications administered to bloodstreams whose circulation followed impossible paths. Vital signs recorded from bodies whose biological processes no longer matched any normal parameters. The touch had become my entire world, my only way of apprehending reality as it dissolved around me. I could no longer trust my eyes. They showed me things that contradicted each other, patients in multiple states simultaneously, spaces that couldn't geometrically exist. I couldn't trust my hearing. The sounds in the ward included screaming that came from directions that weren't part of standard 3-dimensional space, prayers spoken in my own voice though my mouth wasn't moving. But touch remained, that most primitive of senses, and through it I could still distinguish between patient and bed, between flesh and air, between living tissue and whatever the alternative had become. I performed a surgery on the soldier who'd brought the contamination, trying to excise the damaged tissue to cut away the wrongness that had seeded this transformation. His body opened under my scalpel like any other body, revealing internal organs I recognized even as they functioned in ways that violated everything I'd learned. His heart beat backwards, pulling blood from his body and pushing it into nothing, yet somehow he remained alive. His lungs processed atmosphere that wasn't oxygen, extracting energy from something I couldn't measure. His brain showed electrical activity that shouldn't have been possible given its physical structure, thoughts firing through channels that didn't exist in standard neural architecture. I touched his heart while it was exposed, felt it beating backwards against my palm, felt the suction of blood being drawn away into spaces my hand couldn't reach. The sensation was intoxicating and horrifying, intimate in a way that transcended medical procedure, as if in touching his impossible heart, I was touching something fundamental about reality's malleability. He looked at me, his eyes still tracked normally despite everything else changing, and I saw recognition there, understanding, perhaps apology. Then his body collapsed, not into death but into absence, simply ceasing to exist, as if he'd never been there at all. My hands suddenly empty, surrounded by surgical instruments arranged around a operating table that held nothing. The ward's transformation accelerated after that. The beds multiplied through some process of spontaneous generation, filling spaces that shouldn't have been large enough to contain them. The patients multiplied too, or perhaps the same patients existed in multiple states simultaneously, occupying different beds while remaining singular consciousnesses trapped in fragmented forms. I tried to treat them all, moving from bed to bed in patterns that no longer followed linear geography, finding patients I'd just left already ahead of me, needing treatment for different conditions than they'd had moments before. Sister Yevena disappeared during this period, or transformed, or simply stopped being distinguishable from the other changed staff members. We all looked different now, our bodies modified by the contamination in ways that made individual identity increasingly irrelevant. We still performed our duties, dressing wounds, administering medications, recording vital signs, but the procedures had become ritualistic rather than therapeutic. Movements we performed because we'd always performed them rather than because they achieved any meaningful outcomes. The touch remained. Through all the changes, all the impossibility, all the dissolution of normal causality, I could still feel the texture of human skin, still distinguish living flesh from dead tissue, still sense the boundary between self and other through the pressure of contact. This became my anchor as the ward transformed into something that was no longer quite a hospital, no longer quite part of the physical universe I'd been born into. I touched patients and felt their suffering, felt the changes rippling through their bodies, felt the contamination working at cellular and subcellular levels to rewrite their biological code into something new. I don't know how long this continued. Time had become as unreliable as space, hours stretching into subjective days or compressing into moments, clocks on the walls showing different readings simultaneously, my own sense of duration warping until I couldn't distinguish between events that had just happened and memories that might be decades old. But eventually, suddenly, impossibly, it stopped. The ward stabilized into a new configuration, the transformation complete, the contamination having run its course and left us changed but no longer changing. I stood in what looked like Ward 17 but wasn't, not anymore, surrounded by beings that looked like patients but had become something else. Their bodies had settled into new stable states, forms that violated biological principles but functioned nonetheless, that breathed and circulated and metabolized according to different rules but achieved similar outcomes. They were alive, conscious, aware, capable of suffering and perhaps even of healing, but they were no longer quite human in any sense the Imperium's taxonomies recognized. And I was one of them. I looked at my hands, still 5 fingers each, still capable of touching and feeling, but they were wrong in ways I couldn't articulate, as if they belonged to someone who existed in more dimensions than the standard 3 spatial ones. I touched my own face and felt the familiar topography of features I'd worn for 51 years, but the texture was alien, the temperature neither warm nor cold, the sensation filtering through perceptual channels that shouldn't have existed. The Vox system crackled to life, startling in its sudden intrusion of external reality. A voice I didn't recognize announced that Ward 17's quarantine had been lifted, that we were to prepare for inspection and integration review. The contamination had been assessed as stable and potentially useful. The Mechanicus wished to study our transformed biology. The Inquisition required debriefing about what we'd experienced. The Administratum needed to recalculate our resource allocations based on our changed metabolic requirements. We would continue serving, but in different capacities, adapted to our new states. I looked at the patients, the transformed, the changed, the no longer quite human beings I'd been touching for weeks, or months, or however long the transformation had lasted. They looked back at me with eyes that still conveyed emotion despite everything else changing. Fear, confusion, exhaustion, hope, perhaps, though hope for what I couldn't imagine. We'd survived, but survival in the Imperium was never an end point, only a transition to different forms of service, different types of suffering. The first inspection team arrived the next day, tech priests and biologist savants and inquisitorial acolytes, all protected by hazard suits and accompanied by armed guards who kept weapons trained on us throughout the examination. They took samples, blood, tissue, bone marrow, examining our transformed biology with instruments I didn't recognize. They asked questions I couldn't answer properly because the vocabulary for describing what had happened didn't exist in Gothic or any other human language. They recorded everything in data slates and servo skulls, documenting our changed states with the same bureaucratic thoroughness the Administratum brought to all endeavors. The verdict came after a week of examinations. We were contaminated but useful, changed but functional, no longer suitable for standard medical service but adaptable to other roles. The transformed patients would be transferred to specialized labor battalions where their altered physiologies might provide advantages in environments normal humans couldn't survive. The medical staff would be reassigned to a research facility where our continued transformation could be monitored and studied, our experience serving as data points in the Imperium's vast accumulation of knowledge about threats from beyond standard reality. They moved us in sealed transports, 63 survivors from Ward 17's original complement of 234 patients and staff. The others had died or vanished or transformed so completely they could no longer be classified as individual entities. I sat in the transport's dark interior, feeling the vibration of the engine through the floor, touching the cold metal walls with my strange hands and feeling textures that shouldn't exist in simple steel. Around me, the other survivors were quiet, processing their own transformations, their own losses, their own impossible continuations. The research facility was deep underground, carved from bedrock and shielded by meters of blessed ceramite and psychically reinforced walls. They put us in observation cells, comfortable enough by Imperium standards, private rooms with actual beds, regular meals, climate control, but obviously designed for containment rather than care. Medicae attended us, taking endless samples, conducting endless examinations, asking endless questions about our subjective experiences during the transformation. I answered what I could, described the touch sensations and the spatial distortions and the way reality had seemed to become negotiable rather than fixed. They were particularly interested in why I'd maintained functional coherence when so many others had fragmented or dissolved. I couldn't give them a satisfactory answer. Perhaps it was the touch, my focus on tactile sensation providing an anchor when other senses failed. Perhaps it was random chance, survival as lottery rather than merit. Perhaps something in my biology or psychology had made me compatible with the contamination in ways others weren't. The researchers recorded all possibilities without confirming any, adding my testimony to archives that already contained thousands of similar cases, each one a data point in patterns too large for any single mind to comprehend. I've been here 9 years now, time measured by regular cycles of sleeping and waking rather than any external calendar. My transformation has stabilized, but not stopped. I continue changing in small ways, developing new sensory capacities, losing others, my body adapting to its contaminated state through gradual modifications that the researchers document with endless fascination. I can touch things that exist in spaces adjacent to normal reality now, can feel textures that have no physical correlates, can sense presences that others cannot detect. This makes me useful for testing equipment designed to interact with non-standard dimensions, for validating theories about the nature of reality beyond the materium's comfortable lie. The other survivors are here too, scattered throughout the facility in different research divisions, studied for different aspects of their transformations. Sometimes I see them in the communal areas, recognize familiar faces despite the changes, exchange nods or brief words that acknowledge our shared experience without requiring us to articulate what we survived. We're united by trauma and transformation, bound together not by affection but by the simple fact that we remember what it was like before, can compare our current states against the baseline of human normalcy we've lost. The touch remains my defining sense, more developed now than it ever was during my medical service. I can read emotional states through skin contact, can detect illness and injury through the texture of flesh, can sense the subtle wrongness that indicates contamination by forces from beyond standard reality. This makes me valuable to the Inquisition, who occasionally borrow me for examinations of suspected heretics or possessed individuals, using my transformed sensitivity to detect corruptions their instruments might miss. I touch the accused, feel through their skin into their essence, report whether they're clean or contaminated according to criteria I don't fully understand myself. It's not medical service, not really, though it uses skills I learned in Ward 17. It's something else, some new form of function that the Imperium has found for a contaminated former Medicae whose body no longer fits standard human parameters. I serve because the Imperium allows me to continue existing, because my transformation proved useful rather than merely terminal, because in the vast calculus of Imperial resource management, I still register positive value. I think about Ward 17 sometimes, wonder if it still exists in its transformed state, or if the Mechanicus dismantled it for study, removing the contaminated architecture piece by piece to understand how physical space can be rewritten by exposure to forces from beyond reality. I think about the patients I touched during the transformation, wonder if any besides the 63 survivors made it out in forms too changed to recognize as human but still conscious, still suffering, still deserving of the mercy I couldn't provide. I think about Sister Carmilla and her 40 years of service. Wonder if she would have survived the contamination, or if her death was fortune disguised as tragedy. Mostly I think about touch, about the sensation that kept me anchored through transformation, about the texture of human skin and how much information it conveys when you learn to read it properly. I touch things constantly now, walls, furniture, my own altered flesh, reminding myself through tactile sensation that I still exist, that I'm still coherent enough to distinguish between self and environment, that whatever I've become I retain enough humanity to feel the difference between touching and being touched. The Imperium's medical system is vast beyond comprehension, spanning 1 million worlds and treating trillions of patients with varying degrees of care and competence. Ward 17 was one room in one hospital in one hive on one world, statistically insignificant in the vast calculus of the Imperium's functioning. The horror that transformed it was minor compared to the greater threats the Imperium faces: constantly chaos incursions, Xenos invasions, heretical uprisings, mechanical failures. 63 survivors and 171 casualties is barely worth recording in the grand ledger of human suffering that the Imperium maintains. But for those of us who survived, for those of us who were transformed rather than killed, that statistically insignificant horror was everything. It was the end of one existence and the forced beginning of another. It was the price of service in an Imperium that values function over comfort, utility over dignity, survival over sanity. We continue because we must, because the Imperium has determined we're still useful, because in the grim darkness of the far future there is only war and service, and the endless grind of existence in service to an empire that treats humans as resources to be exploited until they're exhausted. I touch the walls of my observation cell, feel the cold, blessed ceramite, feel beneath it the trace contaminations that my transformed senses can detect, feel the vast weight of the hive above pressing down with architectural certainty. I am alive, I am aware. I am suffering in ways the Imperium doesn't acknowledge because my suffering doesn't impair my function. This is mercy. This is what healing looks like in the Imperium's hospitals. This is the horrifying reality of medical service in a civilization that has forgotten the difference between maintenance and care. The Emperor protects, they say, but his protection means only that we're useful enough to preserve, valuable enough to contaminate rather than simply destroy. And so we continue, we transformed and changed and no longer quite human survivors, touching and being touched, feeling our way through existence in forms our bodies weren't designed for, serving the Imperium in whatever capacity our transformations allow. This is what I learned in Ward 17, that healing and horror are inseparable in the Imperium, that medical service means bearing witness to suffering you cannot alleviate, that the human body is merely raw material to be processed according to economic necessities. And this is what I carry with me still, 9 years into transformation, touching reality with hands that feel too much and understand too little. That mercy in the Imperium is measured not by the absence of suffering but by the continuation of function, and that we who serve in the Medicae are not healers, but merely mechanics, maintaining biological machines until they break down completely. The touch reminds me, always the touch, the texture of existence against my transformed skin, the sensation of reality continuing despite everything, the pressure of contact that confirms I still exist in some form, still matter in some small way, still deserve the basic acknowledgement that yes, I am here, I am suffering, I am real, and tomorrow I will touch another subject, feel through their skin for evidence of contamination, report my findings to authorities who will decide their fate based on my testimony. I will continue serving because the alternative is death or madness, or some combination of both. I will perform my function because the Imperium requires it, and I am not permitted to refuse. This is the horrifying reality of Imperial hospitals, not that they fail to heal, but that they succeed in maintaining, in preserving function long past the point where mercy would dictate release. We continue because we must. And the touch remains, the one sense I cannot lose, the one connection to humanity I cannot escape. The Emperor protects, and we endure. and the horrible reality continues, day after day, touch after touch, forever.